Okay, so can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Wow. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for what a really wonderful introduction. Thank you for the opportunity for me to, speak to the University of California, Irvine. I really wanted to be there. But yes, act of nature, act of God, all of that changed it. But I'm happy to really have the opportunity to talk about my work, which really focuses on cognitive aging, and in particular, looking at risk and protective factors, and with the focus really on Black Americans. So what I'd like to do today is really just maybe give a sort of like an overview of how I kind of came to this work, which was a little bit unbeknownst to me that I looked at it from a perspective of the life course, and then highlight some of my past work, and then hopefully lead into my present work and some, sort of like where I'm thinking about what's to come. So some of these are some preliminary thoughts and not fully formed, but nonetheless, I think is sort of important to kind of have you think about my own thinking as I look at this work. So I don't know how many of you remember this. If you do, maybe you can raise your hand. For those in the room, I don't know if any of you remember this, but I think some of you would. This probably feels a little bit like what we just came out of, but this is actually a Newsweek cover from 2003. So over 20 years ago. And so really what this shows was the first iteration of SARS, which that outbreak lasted about 6 months or so, and it had spread to about more than a dozen countries. And so really how I got interested in, I guess, thinking about public health, who I worked for at the time, his name is Dr. Dennis Mackey. He's a professor of medicine now, a full professor of medicine at the University of Wisconsin. And he got called forward by the president to really think about how we can combat the spread of SARS at that time, because it was moving very rapidly and they didn't know what to do. And so he got called up by the president to put forth some recommendations. And who he worked with sort of day and night was a public health epidemiologist, and not, other doctors, but a public health epidemiologist. And I said to myself, wow, I thought I wanted to be an infectious disease physician, but I realized that I wanted to have a much broader impact. And that's what really led me to my, I guess you could say, my love and my passion for wanting to study public health. And obviously, as you know, we're in SARS-CoV-2, which is commonly now called COVID-19. So this was truly the first iteration of SARS. And now we're all very familiar with the pandemic and, of course, wearing masks. And so I won't go over a lot of this because, Dara really did a great job of outlining my trajectory, where I started out, again, pursuing public health, and I got my master's from the School of Medicine and Public Health at UW-Madison. And then I actually was fortunate enough to go on to do a public health fellowship, where I was placed in two places. One was the City of Milwaukee Health Department, and then the second was the American Cancer Society. And those were very different. When I worked at the City of Milwaukee Health Department, I focused primarily on birth outcomes, and I'll present a little bit of that work to you. And then I also looked at cancer disparities at the American Cancer Society. And so I was very fortunate to sort of live and breathe this work in a different context, looking at both different health outcomes and different populations to some degree. And then finally, I decided that it was important for me to pursue my doctorate, so I really could be able to study and answer the questions that I thought were salient to me. And subsequently, I decided to go on to do my postdoc in the Institute of Gerontology, which is really what brought me to my love and my focus on aging. So, what do I say when I say life course? Really, I'm thinking about this sort of trajectory about infancy to old age. And the reason I say that is because, one of the very first studies I did in Wisconsin was I looked at whether or not there were Black-white disparities in birth outcomes. Actually, what I found was that there was a twofold greater risk of a Black infant having a death compared to a white infant. But what was really alarming was that this disparity was actually more pronounced among mothers that were highly educated, meaning that those that had a college education or more actually had a threefold greater risk, that was Black mothers, of having an infant death compared to white mothers. So again, education necessarily isn't trading off to have the same benefit as it did in white mothers as it did in Black mothers. So that sort of got me thinking, what is it then that's happening? Is it maybe just potentially this sort of period in the life course? or is it something else? I also felt like this resonated with me personally because, after all, I was a Black woman myself pursuing a higher education degree, my master's at the time. And I thought to myself, why wouldn't education translate to having some sort of a protective effect for myself compared to my white counterpart? And so I thought about, well, potentially, is it something happening in the college environment? And for me, I looked at two things: whether or not a racially tense campus climate, and then students basically saying, hey, I didn't have the abilities to cope with that. They essentially reported having worse mental health. And then finally, I thought, well, what about when we move out of the college environment into the workforce? Is there something in our interpersonal interactions that, again, that contributing to a disparity? And what I found was that higher levels of discrimination was indeed associated with greater levels of psychological distress. So this was a multiracial sample. So it included Latinos, African Americans, and whites, etc. However, although we saw overall that there was this positive association between discrimination and psychological distress, this effect was actually weakest among Blacks. So then that got me thinking, well, is there potentially some sort of resilience or protective factor that's operating at this point in the life course that could be potentially protective, that could be something that may actually be beneficial, that African Americans have developed over time? And then that brings me sort of to my, sort of my current body of work and how I think about cognition, and really then wanting to begin to understand whether or not we see these same sort of disparities, but in particular in old age. So, some of you might be thinking of, DeAnnah, you presented a lot from mental health outcomes to birth outcomes. Why cognition? Why is that so important? Well, it's not just myself, but I definitely see cognition as a fundamental aspect of our health, not only our ability to like navigate the world, but obviously we know that our mental health or our cognitive health have a direct impact or can directly influence our physical health, and in particular our physical functioning, such as when we think about the impact of dementia on our instrumental activities of daily living. So that is being able to balance your checkbook, clothe yourself, feed yourself. We all know that these sort of have an impact when you develop dementia, and potentially this is where we then need to see the critical role of caregiving. And so not only that, but the CDC partnered with the Alzheimer's Association, and they put forth this initiative to really educate communities around cognitive decline, and really saying that, hey, this is a public health concern, and more importantly, it's a crisis when we think about the impact of cognitive decline in older adults. And then finally, when I think about cognition, I think it's important for me to define what I mean by that. So if we think about this spectrum here, where we sort of have this optimal cognitive functioning, bearing in mind that we're not born with some sort of cognitive deficit of something that nature, then we hopefully will all come in with sort of normal cognitive ability. As we move through the life course, we began to see some significant but measurable cognitive declines, which have been coined mild cognitive impairment, and then obviously subsequently potentially onto dementia, which again could interfere with our physical functioning. Now, the reason that I have this line dotted between mild cognitive impairment and dementia is because, although we know that age is the greatest risk factor for cognitive decline, it's not a guarantee. So that's why this line is dashed, because even though you have some significant, potentially or slight measurable cognitive decline in the form of mild cognitive impairment, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to go on and develop dementia. And then finally, this statistic is literally around the corner. In fact, statistics now are actually projecting out to 2060, but they don't change in that, 1 in 5 adults will be 65 and older. And also that we also know that with that demographic shift that we will see nearly double the amount of racial and ethnic minority older adults. So this really is the face of the future. We often tell our students that they are, which to some degree that's true, but not necessarily with the demographic shift that we're about to see. And this is largely due to the baby boomers. And so why not then think about these populations and whether or not what risk and protective factors are salient for them? So that really brings me to sort of my whole scope of research in terms of, again, thinking about risk and protective factors. And so when I think about risk, I think of that on two spectrums. One, I think about that in terms of health status. So chronic conditions broadly, mostly around blood pressure, and then thinking about various forms of stressors from discrimination to perceived stress. And then, of course, thinking about what sort of protective factors may play a role when we think about social support or education, for example. Now, when we think about, what the literature has shown, really when we go back quite some time, very, very robustly, even, more recently, and as well as older literature has shown that Blacks are disproportionately impacted when we think about cognitive test scores at baseline, and when we think about overall having a higher risk of cognitive disease, as well as a greater incidence and prevalence of dementia. But what's not necessarily so consistent is whether or not the findings that we see cross-sectionally are mimicked longitudinally. And so I reviewed more than 12 studies, but but of the 12 studies I'll highlight here now, specifically that were longitudinal, they essentially showed mixed findings. That is, some studies showed a positive association, meaning that I'm sorry, some studies showed that that Blacks actually performed worse over time compared to whites. Other studies showed that whites performed worse than Blacks. And some studies showed no racial difference whatsoever in terms of cognitive trajectories. But of these 12 studies, 11 of them, so almost all of them except one, included an average age of 65 and above. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, DeAnnah, you just said that, by 2030, and even projecting out more than that, that 1 in 5 adults will be 65 and older. So it makes sense. However, when we think about identifying whether or not there is truly a disparity in terms of cognitive trajectories, could it be possible that if we're only including older age adults in most of these studies, most of these longitudinal studies, could we potentially be missing the point at which a disparity actually emerges? What if, in fact, it emerges earlier in the life course? So moving now to really sort of the foundational work, right? My past work, this first study, what I really wanted to do was understand whether or not, yes, indeed, do we see Black-white differences in terms of cognitive trajectories? And if we do see those differences, at what age do those differences emerge? I may not go through these other two studies, but I think that they're important to sort of build out my past work, which is then thinking about whether or not when we look within Blacks, is there an association between disease burden and, of course, greater risk for changes in cognitive health? And then finally, thinking about, again, one form of a stressor, which is financial hardship. So if we look at the combined effect of financial hardship and poor health, is there an association with episodic memory, looking specifically within Blacks? So for this first study, again, I wanted to understand whether or not there was a disparity and hopefully be able to see where that disparity emerges in the life course. I want to, of course, acknowledge my co-authors for this, as well as the American Public Health Association for, at that time, I got the Early Investigator Award or New Investigator Award for this work. And that was, a bit scary because I was saying to the larger community that, hey, we do need to include a larger range of ages when we think about disparities. And so, kind of going against the grain of what's typically or what had been done to date. So the sample that I used here is the Americans Changing Lives. This was a US sample of adults who were 25 and older at baseline, and Black Americans and those who were 60 and older were sampled at twice the rate of others. And this study really spanned 25 years, and it had 5 different data collection points. And so what I want to show you first is just the racial distribution across all 5 of these waves. And really the only reason I'm highlighting this is that essentially what you can see is that there's about 60% of whites in this sample, non-Hispanic whites, to about 30% non-Hispanic Blacks. And that's maintained relatively all the way through wave 5. So In terms of cognition, this study used the short portable mental status questionnaire, and I should say that this measure is definitely dated. It's not really used to date right now, but at the time in 1986, it was commonly used to as a global measure of cognitive ability. And it really assesses three domains: that's orientation, knowledge, and working memory. So for example, orientation is what's today's date, knowledge is what's the current president, and then what's the former president. And then working memory was assessed with the task where the respondents had to subtract 3 from 21 serially until obviously they got to a number less than 3. So essentially what this is saying is that more cognitive errors is indicative of worse cognitive health or worse mental status. And so essentially wanting to have less errors, which is indicative of better. So I controlled for a host of things, including age at baseline and age squared, because we wouldn't necessarily expect that the relationship between age and cognitive functioning is linear, that it actually could be nonlinear, as well as a host of health risk factors, health behaviors, and then also looking at mortality and attrition, given that this was a 25-year time span of the study. Okay, so this is the baseline data stratified by race for non-Hispanic whites and Blacks. And the first thing I want to call your attention to is that in this sample, at least at baseline, Blacks are reporting at least twice the amount of diabetes compared to whites. This will become important later as I go through some of the other studies. So here's the crude model. Age is again on the x-axis, the number of cognitive errors, meaning more cognitive errors, worse health. So this is not taking into account anything. And as you can see, even when you adjust for all the socio-demographic, health behaviors, attrition, etc., that essentially what we do see as expected is that there is a disparity in that Blacks make more cognitive errors and whites make less. Now, what's important here is the point at which there is a divergence, which actually occurred at 45. Now, although it looks like the confidence intervals are not overlapping at age 35, they in fact did in this model. So essentially what this shows is that, and at this case, we centered age at 75. So what we can say in alignment with existing literature is that, again, there are Black-white differences in baseline cognitive errors at older ages, which again, Blacks are, disproportionately impacted. We also see that there is changes in terms of how that association over time, which Blacks make more cognitive errors at whites, but this disparity really begins to emerge at middle age, and it in fact worsens with age. As you could see that those curves actually continue to widen at the older ages. And we further know that once we take into account most of the variables in the model, that they essentially do not explain these racial differences. So that got me thinking, then what is it? Is it potentially that Blacks were coming into the sample overall less healthy? And is that potentially driving this larger racial difference that we see? Which leads me to this second study, and it's essentially what I wanted to know was, what is the association between disease burden and looking specifically within Blacks, whether or not there's an association in terms of cognitive abilities in later life. I want to again acknowledge my co-authors for their contributions to this work. So first, let's establish the link between chronic conditions and cognitive health. We know that cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and hypertension, they essentially lead to vascular compromise, which then increases one's risk for both vascular as well as Alzheimer's dementia. We further know that there is an association between vascular risk and cognitive changes. Studies have shown, for example, that higher baseline vascular risk is associated with decreased processing speed when you're looking at about a 2.5-year follow-up. And another risk factor that's probably not commonly studied is lung functioning. So we know that pulmonary function is used as not only a biomarker of aging, but overall general health. Why is that? Because we know that our lung capacity decreases as we age. And so studies have found that after you control for education, age, and even smoking history, that lung functioning is in fact a significant predictor of general cognitive ability in older Blacks. So the data sample that I use for this is the Baltimore study of Black aging, patterns of cognitive aging. This is an NIA-funded study where basically community dwelling Black adults were collected at 2 different time points, approximately 3 years apart. And they were taken from primarily independent living facilities in Baltimore. So the purpose of the BSBA was really, it had multiple, I guess you could say, objectives, but one of the primary objectives was to understand changes in cognitive health, as well as looking at changes, how those changes correlate with other changes in terms of the rate of change in terms of health and changing along with those sort of simultaneously. So these are all the variables that were measured. Why I want to highlight is really all the top is the yellow. Those were all the cognitive measures that the BSBA assessed. And the red and the orange are all the health and psychosocial measures that were assessed. So essentially, in this case, how I defined cognition was really through 5 domains: working memory, perceptual or processing speed, verbal memory, and vocabulary, and then of course, inductive reasoning. Now, you might be thinking, why is it that vocabulary is in a different color than the other cognitive domains? Does anybody have a thought as to why that is?
Because it's tied with education.
That's a great guess. To some degree, that's actually accurate. It goes back to sort of crystallized and intelligence, which, as we know, that as we age, our fluid intelligence decreases, unfortunately. Of course, our processing speed, our memory, but our crystallized intelligence, which is our vocabulary, actually improves as we age. So that is why I had it in a different color to think about, again, this idea between fluid and crystallized domains of intelligence. But which is obviously, yes, to some degree, one could argue your vocabulary is indeed and tied to your level of education or formal education. Okay. Oh, yeah. So, there's another question. Please feel free to stop me.
Stan, you use big words. Whether you know what they mean.
Okay. So in this case, when I wanted to really get at this idea of chronic disease burden, these were self-reported, and I basically did a summary of these various chronic conditions, and then I dichotomized them into 2 or more versus 1 or none. So really getting at this ideal of disease burden. Here's everything I controlled for. There's that measure of lung functioning with as measured by average peak expiratory flow, where you obviously blow into a tool to measure that lung functioning capacity. And then, of course, blood pressure. So now this is the stratified by waves, because this is all an all Black sample. And as you can see, at baseline, there were 602 Black Americans, and then at follow-up, there were 450, so some attrition. But what's more important is that even in this sample, what you see is that Black Americans, nearly 83% compared to 62%, which is still relatively high, are reporting having high blood pressure. So again, Blacks are coming in overall with less that are less healthy, at least by self-reported measures. Okay, so what did I find? As expected, a greater number of health conditions was indeed associated with significantly slower processing speed once you adjusted for all the model covariates. And this is a fluid domain, of course, a fluid ability when we think about information processing speed. And then when we look at the relationship between lung functioning, what we see was actually a positive association. So better lung functioning was actually associated with improved working memory and faster processing speed. So what we can really take from this is that indeed different aspects of our health have a differential impact on specific fluid domains of cognitive change in later life. And one could argue that we maybe even need to think about lung functioning as a potential, the mechanism by which that leads to better cognitive ability over time. And so I said to myself, okay, if we're seeing this association as expected, that there's greater disease burden leading to worse cognitive health, could it be that if you are have this disease burden, this disease burden coupled with uh, financial difficulty, would that combined effect actually then be more burdensome in terms of your cognitive ability in later life? I want to again thank my co-authors for their contribution to this work. Um, so for I've already sort of established that there is a link between chronic conditions and cognitive dysfunction or potential cognitive decline over time, as well as greater risk for dementia. And we also know that that there is this inverse association between disease burden being associated with worse cognition over time. And we further know that chronic conditions are more prevalent in Blacks than they are in whites. But when we think about the role of financial hardship, studies have established that there is an association between life course financial strain or life course financial difficulty and worse health outcomes, including physical disability and depression. So could it be that financial strain, whether it's not necessarily over the life course, but at any point, could that also then be potentially related to worse cognitive functioning in older Blacks? The study I use for this is the health and retirement study, which essentially is, again, a non-institutionalized sample of adults that are 51 and older at baseline. I use specifically the 2006 sample of Black Americans, which was 934 who completed the psychosocial leave behind questionnaire. The reason that is that that psychosocial leave behind questionnaire was really great. It asked questions about financial difficulty and a whole other host of psychosocial measures. In this case, I looked at episodic memory, a 10-item word learning task, essentially where I assessed immediate and delayed recall. And what I did was I created a composite by averaging the two standardized immediate and delayed recall scores. Okay, and then for this, I, again, these self-reported health conditions to get at this ideal of burden, but this time I categorized it as having none of these conditions, one of these conditions, and two or more of these conditions. And then financial hardship was assessed by one question. Participants were asked, how difficult is it for you or your family to meet monthly payments on you or your family's bills? And it was a Likert-like scale from not at all difficult to very or completely difficult. And then here are the socio-demographic variables that I controlled for. So first, let me, so again, this is the 2006 934 Blacks who completed that psychosocial leave behind questionnaire in the HRS. And first and foremost, that more than a third of the sample reported somewhat difficulty paying their monthly bills. More than half the sample reported having at least one health condition. So again, I'm highlighting this because I've shown you three different samples. And what you essentially can see is that Black Americans are coming in not only with worse health, but less formal education and potentially more financial hardship. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through this graph. What you can see here is the number of chronic conditions on the x-axis. This is the predicted episodic memory score, that composite, and essentially stratified according to the level of financial hardship. So having no financial hardship, meaning you are financially solvent or financially stable, essentially what you see at the highest levels of chronic conditions, two or more, the episodic memory score is actually lower compared to those who say that they have complete or somewhat financial difficulty. They're at the highest levels of chronic disease burden. What you can see here is that they actually have better episodic memory scores or higher episodic memory scores. So essentially, saying this a different way, what we see was not as expected, that disease burden is in fact more strongly associated with worse episodic memory in older Blacks, less financial hardship, meaning those that are able to pay their monthly bills are financially solvent. So again, this sort of brought me back to my early work when I looked at the effect of education and whether or not there was a modifying effect of education on the association between race and birth outcomes. And indeed, I found a threefold greater risk among highly educated women compared to highly educated Black women compared to highly educated white women. And so, this then raises the question again, why aren't greater financial means or resources not necessarily acting as a protective factor against poor memory functioning in older Blacks? One of the reasons, one of the, I guess I could say one of the hypotheses that I thought about that would potentially explain these findings is the diminishing returns hypothesis, which essentially says that there are systematically smaller health gains from the economic resources for Blacks in comparison to whites. Further, this idea of that greater SES could potentially expose Blacks to more adversity and discrimination. That's been postulated potentially because they are operating in more white spaces. So the types of jobs that they take or the neighborhoods that they decide to live in, which inadvertently can then obviously expose them to more discrimination and adversity. Needless to say, what this really also then points to is the importance of looking at financial hardship, because even among seemingly healthy Blacks, those who had zero chronic health conditions, financial hardship still may be a prominent risk factor for poor memory. And that kind of goes back to this, if you look at the other end of this graph down where there's no conditions, as you can see here, again, the black line being those that are not at all having financial difficulty versus, again, this dotted line. So that shows you that even when you're seemingly healthy, again, it may be the financial hardship that's pushing down your overall cognitive health. So let me summarize, because I gave you a lot. First and foremost, we know that there are Black-white differences when we look at baseline cognitive tests at older ages. We further know that these disparities emerge at middle ages, and they worsen as age increases. We further know that there is an association between greater disease burden and declines, at least with specific fluid cognitive domains in middle to later life among Black Americans. And then finally, we know that disease burden is indeed more strongly associated with worse episodic memory in older Blacks with less financial hardship, or those who are most financially solvent. The implications of this really then says, one, we need to think about the risk factors that are in alignment with health. So again, is it the overall disease burden or the burden of chronic conditions in Black Americans that's really driving then the larger racial differences that we're seeing, which would then argue that we think about reducing health disparities that disproportionately affect Blacks. And then, should we be thinking about other stressors, given that this was a single item measure that really looked at one's ability to pay monthly bills? So are there other measures of financial hardship or other stressors that are potentially just as salient or as important? And that leads me really finally now to my present work, which, now thinking, sort of shifting gears in terms of thinking about other risk factors beyond health and financial hardship, and really this idea of perceived stress and whether or not their blood pressure has an influence in terms of that association. So at least according to stress and coping theory, which has been well established, that we know that chronic activation of our cortisol receptors leads to elevated inflammation. And we also know that APHA axis dysregulation leads to atrophy in key brain structures, such as our frontal lobe and our hippocampus, which are essential for memory and processing speed. And we also know that Black Americans are disproportionately exposed to various forms of stressors, including perceived stress, accumulated stressors, and even stressors across the life course. And then when we think about this association in particular with blood pressure, a recent review of 149 studies across 26 countries, at least in midlife, found that hypertension was significantly associated with worse cognition in later life, particularly when we look at the domains of memory, executive functioning, as well as global cognition. And studies have further shown that even exposure to moderate to high levels of chronic stress over time definitely contributes to a greater risk of hypertension in middle-aged Black Americans. So for this study, I wanted to basically look at the relationship between perceived stress and whether or not there was a change in cognition among Blacks, and then whether or not this relationship indeed varied by blood pressure. Going back to the Baltimore sample, which I've already sort of highlighted, so I'm not going to go through everything. I just wanted to call your attention to it. In this case, again, looking at those same 5 cognitive domains of working memory all the way through inductive reasoning. And then this measure of perceived stress, the 14-item perceived stress scale, which again is in the last month, how often have you, and then, you know, various questions around level of stress on a Likert-like scale. And then 3 readings of blood pressure were collected and averaged for each participant. And so this is looking at both diastolic and systolic blood pressure treated continuously. Okay, here's everything that I controlled for. If you recall this, again, this prior graph of the demographics. Okay, so what did I found? Essentially, I found no direct effect of stress on cognitive changes, but I did find moderation by blood pressure. In fact, individuals with high systolic blood pressure had significantly higher inductive reasoning scores at increasing levels of stress versus those with low systolic blood pressure. Diastolic blood pressure was obviously marginally associated with inductive reasoning at follow-up, but none of the other 4 cognitive domains. And so this says that there is a potential joint effect of stress on blood pressure in a nuanced way. These are sort of counterintuitive. We expected individuals that had high systolic or high blood pressure and high stress would, of course, have worse cognitive ability. And that it would obviously impact more than one cognitive domain, but in this case, it only affected inductive reasoning, which really then merits further investigation. And again, going back to this idea of are there additional stressors? We're using here a single measure of perceived stress, but if there are other measures of stress, would there be potentially a different association? And then finally, you know, thinking about, at this point, I feel like I've presented a lot of work on risk factors, now sort of shifting and thinking about the influence of protective factors. And in this case, looking at whether or not social support and the receipt of social support actually influence the relationship between stress and cognition. I again wanted to go back and see whether or not we see an association between a direct effect of stress and cognition, and then whether or not that relationship varied by one's level of satisfaction with the social support that they received. So social support was asked by this question: how satisfied are you with the emotional or instrumental support that you get from your family and friends in terms of how they make you feel and how much it helps you? This is someone who comforts you, calms you down when you're upset, someone who makes you feel close to them, and is there for you to confide in on a Likert scale of not at all satisfied to extremely satisfied. Here are everything that I controlled for. Okay, so preliminarily what I found, this is, I just submitted this as part of a symposium at the Gerontological Society of America. So hopeful that it'll get accepted, where we're looking at caregiving and social support is really the theme of this symposium, and this is part of that work. So as expected, we did not find a direct effect again on stress on the cognitive changes, but what we found was that at least with instrumental support, there was a marginal association in terms of it modifying the relationship between perceived stress and working memory at follow-up, that's at wave 2, but again, not related to any of the other cognitive domains. So this was in the expected direction. So this is the interaction. This is again perceived stresses on the x-axis and then predicted working memory on the y, stratified by the level of satisfaction with instrumental support. And as you can see, those who reported higher satisfaction with the receipt of their instrumental support actually had better working memory, even at high levels of stress. So again, there's some protective effect, at least with instrumental support, that's operating here in this sample of Black Americans. And what I'm going to do from here is, one, look at whether there are some cohort effects. So breaking up this sample and looking at whether or not there's a difference between the type of social support that you're satisfied that you get potentially in midlife versus in old age, and then considering other forms of social support. And where I think I'm going now, just to sort of, as I'm beginning to wrap up, I essentially wanted to think about Other risk factors at a biological level, a lot of the work I've presented to this point has been much more on a psychosocial focus, such as disease burden and stress and discrimination, which are important, but now wanting to think about biological risk factors in terms of inflammation. So I want to again acknowledge my co-author for her contribution to this work. So let's first think about the link between discrimination and inflammation, which we know that discrimination can indeed have a detrimental impact on multiple physiological pathways, multiple physiological systems, in fact, allostatic load, as well as individual systems such as inflammation. And we further know that this association has been shown in Black Americans, but really the findings are mixed. That is, some studies have indeed shown a positive association, looking specifically within Blacks, and increased inflammation. And other studies have, for example, found no association. And as you can also see here in these studies, the age range quite varies. So this association has been found in only older Blacks that are 65 and older, and others have looked at Blacks that are sort of in their mid 30s all the way through their 80s. And then when we think about the effect of sex on this association between discrimination and inflammation, again, the evidence is a bit conflicting or unclear. So using a multi-ethnic sample, Kershaw found that 3 forms of discrimination was in fact associated with elevated interleukin-6 in women, but this association was attenuated once BMI was controlled for. Lifetime discrimination was unrelated in men, and everyday discrimination, in the contrast, everyday discrimination was actually related to lower inflammation in men. And then all 3 of these discrimination measures were basically unrelated to C-reactive protein, another inflammatory biomarker for both men and women. So again, the evidence in terms of whether or not sex actually modifies this association is a bit unclear. And then when we think about whether or not we look at the modifying effect of sex and race, what we see is that, again, the evidence is conflicting and unclear. So thinking about race, ethnicity, lifetime discrimination, we see that that is indeed associated with higher inflammatory burden in Black and white women, but it is contingent upon the number of experiences. So in Black women, you see 1 to 2 experiences, in comparison to white women, 3 or more experiences. In contrast, race, ethnicity, the same form of discrimination was actually related to lower CRP in Black men and unrelated in white men. So just to summarize, again, what we can see is that chronic inflammation is indeed, and greater, overall physiological dysregulation may be indeed as a result of experiencing discrimination throughout one's lifespan. And these effects are particularly pronounced in midlife and older ages. We know that most of these studies have focused on 1 or 2 versus 3 or more forms of discrimination, and very few of them have considered workplace discrimination. And typically, the discrimination-inflammation relationship has been examined using either multiracial samples or done with the comparative analyses versus, again, looking specifically within Blacks. So that was the aim of this study, was to examine basically 4 forms of discrimination and inflammatory dysregulation in middle-aged and older Black Americans, and then whether or not this relationship varied by sex. I used the National Survey of Midlife in the United States. In particular, this was a cross-sectional sample of Black Americans who participated in the second wave of the MIDAS and the Biomarker Project. So the sample consisted of 151 Black women and 76 Black men who had complete data on all 5 inflammatory biomarkers that we treated as our outcome. Okay, so what were the inflammatory markers that we looked at? C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, fibrinogen, E-selectin, and then the intracellular adhesion molecule. And we basically created a summary of those and really then categorize individuals in terms of these high-risk quartiles. Okay, so for the 4 measures of discrimination, lifetime and daily, 11-item version, a 9-item version. And then here are the 2 measures that I used for workplace discrimination. That's both of them were 6 items. The first one was chronic job discrimination, essentially looking at, so for example, being watched more closely was one of the questions, and then perceived inequality at work, where participants were asked how much they perceive themselves to receive less respect, work-related respect, opportunities, and satisfaction than others. Okay. Here's everything I controlled for, number of demographic as well as health covariates. I wanted to show you the stratified sample for Black men and Black women. And what I want to call your attention to is, at least for fibrinogen, that's that highest risk quartile, the top quartile, what you can see here is that Black women have much greater inflammatory burden compared to Black men. However, on average, Black men reported significantly more job discrimination compared to Black women. So let me show you what I found. One, we found that lifetime discrimination and inequality at work are indeed associated with increased inflammatory burden in the overall sample, once you adjust for the demographic and health covariates. And we also found this modifying effect of sex, where lifetime and job discrimination were significantly associated with greater inflammatory burden among Black women, but not in Black men. So the implications of this work really then says, well, one, that specific types of discrimination do indeed lead to a greater risk of physiological dysregulation. Further, our findings support the notion that there is variation by sex, such that discrimination truly is a more salient risk factor, at least for chronic inflammation in Black women, than it is in Black men, even though we see Black men report higher levels of job discrimination. And finally, although the mechanisms underlying the observed associations in women have yet to be disentangled, what this really then highlights is the critical need for more sex-specific research in this area. And so my next steps is to continue to think about the biological underpinnings of cognitive decline in Black Americans via inflammation. I'm going to be using another study, Health ABC, the dynamics of health, aging, and body composition. This is again an NIA-funded study that's been sunsetted. But it has about 11 to 12 cognitive endpoints. So I'll be able to get at really these cognitive trajectories and whether or not inflammation is associated with cognitive trajectories versus at the prior study I showed you is cross-sectional. And then thinking further about, this inflammation cognition relationship and going back to the ideal of blood pressure and stress and whether or not they have a mediating and potentially moderating role. So I do want to, of course, acknowledge my funding sources, the National Institutes of Aging, as well as the Alzheimer's Association. And I definitely want to acknowledge my KO1 mentoring team, who without them, I feel like I'm standing on the backs of giants. I would not be here because they've been wonderful in my trajectory and my training and development. And I want to thank all of you for your time and appreciate your attention today.
Hi, DeAnnah. It's
Hi.
Joni.
Okay. How are you?
I'm good. So DeAnnah and I went to grad school together at UCLA. And she was finishing her dissertation when I was a consultant there. So DeAnnah and I have known each other for a really long time. It looks like we have a great question. So I'm gonna Eric gets to first.
I want you to know the new dress.
We have a couple of questions for you, DeAnnah. Eric and then Dan.
Dr. Byrd, that was really fantastic. Thank you, and you're really tackling the most difficult thing, which is the old, now new, always renewed debate of nature and nurture, and it's very, very hard to do. And you've made incredible strides in that. For us, and I think one of the highlights for me is, of course, the notion of crystallized intelligence. I was going to say, where's the limit with fossilized intelligence? We'll talk about that later.
Okay.
Because you're bringing you have so many biological variables, I'm wondering, I'm sure you've thought about it, is how are you going to do any kind of studies involving epigenetics? In particular, there's been a lot of papers on epigenetics of aging. There are epigenetic markers of bioage that sometimes are significantly different from chronological age. And it's a complicated measure, but I'm just wondering if you're thinking about that. One hypothesis, for example, could be that kind of the accelerated aging in African Americans that in fact makes everything goes faster, and that's just nothing yet can be done about because dementia, Alzheimer's will come faster because the span is, but maybe it's a completely wrong hypothesis. Anyway, I'm just, those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's, to your point, there's been a lot, thank you for your question. There's been a lot of work, in epigenetics. And, one of the things I'm looking at potentially in health ABC is telomere length, which has, a lot of work been done in that area. And we see that that's, obviously some form of biological aging. And, you know, the damage to our DNA, et cetera, that does accelerate not only overall aging, but then potentially could that accelerate, you know, cognitive decline. So really important. I think, you know, yes, it's a lot to unpack there. Inflammation has been, studied, but I still think that there is a lot to be done in sort of, looking at even multiple system dysregulation, such as allostatic load, which again is indicative of, accelerated aging. And so, you know, I'm hoping to, sort of move a little bit from the inflammation and then pull in the telomere length, even if it's not within my current KO1, potentially the next grant that I seek, because I do feel that, expanding sort of the biological risk factors and the conversations around that is going to require that.
No, thank you, Dr. Byrd. And you know, just to reiterate, you've made it clear why I'm smarter than everybody here. And second, as a pulmonologist, I appreciated the relationship between lung function and cognitive ability. I've always thought that. But here's my one question for you. So, you know, obviously dealing with these difficult problems like racism, which are at the root, is going to take a long, long time and slowly progressing. But in the meantime, we'd like to figure out ways that we can improve these numbers. Have you thought, I'm sure you have, but using outlier analysis. So for example, in the group of older African Americans of a certain, you know, category or cohort who you would have expected to have a greater decline, there must be some who did not, or in fact, you know, had got better with age. And could we find out what that secret sauce is and maybe use that?
Yeah, actually, I mean, my mentors, you know, Keith Whitfield and Roland Thorpe, they've done a lot of work, in this idea of older African Americans who actually are living, you know, this crossover effect. They're outliving some white Americans. They make it past, you know, well into their 80s and beyond. And what is it about them that's different than others? Some of the things that have been put forward is that, you know, one, there's some level of resiliency. That's obviously, and then also, is there some potential, you know, like some really effective coping mechanism that's just been developed over time to where when you're responding to discrimination and stress, it just doesn't have the same impact on you. Now, I want to be careful there because I just published a paper with, David Williams' former student, Ruja Chin, and, in that paper, we looked at discrimination and cognition, and we used a multi-ethnic sample, a multiracial sample, and we actually found that more discrimination led to better cognition. And we wanted to be careful there because the very few studies that have come out, Lisa Barnes is one of the first ones, by the way, that did some work in that area, specifically with Black Americans, is that this idea that what has been put forth is that maybe there's also a numbing effect. So it's not necessarily healthy. So we don't want to, you know, say, hey, yeah, let's keep going out and discriminating against people. No. That's going to like have them like age better and be cognitively intact. Not necessarily. So this idea of a numbing effect that you become numb to it over time, but that goes back to the really important question that was raised earlier, which is that then having some sort of physiological response, which is obviously detrimental. So I hope that somewhat answers your question that yes, there is definitely research that shows there is a crossover effect. There are some older African Americans that are living longer. And, you know, what is it about them compared to other groups? And then obviously, you know, then thinking about what is the real response with some of the newer literature looking at this association between discrimination and cognitive health. Because as we know, the link between discrimination and physical health and other mental health outcomes has been well established, but less so when it comes to cognitive health.
Yes, sir. I have one question. I know we're running short on time. This is kind of related to what Dan brought up, but also, DeAnnah, I think it was study B where you had the multiple waves and you showed how, I think it was the rate of diabetes went down from like one wave to the next. Some of what you're discussing around this kind of longitudinal effect has me thinking that maybe that we have some kind of like selection effect, where it's like the fact that the African Americans that are making it to the older ages are just kind of like genetically different than the folks that were in the early ages. And it made me harken back to some of the work I did with nephrology, right? Where we would talk about the fact that you end up with these African Americans on dialysis who would live longer, right? Once they made it to the fact of being on dialysis, which wasn't a good outcome. But then they were like, there's this kind of resiliency happening where they would live longer on dialysis. And so I was just wondering if you had thought about the fact that like thinking about the changes in the demographics and maybe even the genetics of some of the African Americans we're seeing over time, and whether or not maybe that's potentially what we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there is a selection effect. I mean, we know that the baby boomers have really unique experiences, right? They're really what's driving this larger demographic shift in our population overall. And that's just not here in the US, by the way. We're going to see this like globally, by the way, in other countries and et cetera. And this ideal of blue zones and why is it that in certain areas people are living longer? So this question isn't just important for, I think, African Americans. And I think, what is it about that is driving that? I was recently reading something, I don't know, maybe it was USA Today, and they were saying that there's really 3 key things that you can do. And I think it said something like strength and stretching, diet, and there was something else, but those things were like, I think diet was like 70% of it or something that really contributes to longevity. So yes, I definitely feel like there maybe is a selection effect and potentially even who participates in these studies. So although the health and retirement study is ongoing, some of these earlier work, like the Baltimore sample, Americans Changing Lives, they've been sunsetted, even Health ABC. So I think it'll be important to really think about, as we collect new data, how we are including and how we're recruiting. So we really do get, I would argue, a broader pool of participants to see what is really ultimately driving some of the differences. Is it a selection effect? Is it the genetic? Or is it earlier, as the gentleman said, is it environment? Maybe it's argued it's a combination of all of them, honestly, but that's what I would think.
Thank you. Was there any questions from those on Zoom? Wrap up. I'm gonna go over to Eric. I think you want to say something?
No, that we should wrap up.
Oh, yeah. So thank you so much, DeAnnah. This was wonderful. It is great to see you. Hopefully we'll be able to for you to make it out here when it's not storming in Texas. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. This was amazing. This was fantastic. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.